So plant care, so one of the first things you can do is let nature do the work. So as the example of the O&M building where we didn't touch it, we didn't irrigate it, we didn't go up there I think we were there in April, and we didn't go back till October. So nobody touched that roof whatsoever. So, and then the ideal roof doesn't require any trimming, edging, fertilization, et cetera, et cetera. So the O&M building didn't get any of this. Now, when we got up there, we found ourselves having a difficult time not sort of cleaning up. You know, I think we're all sort of born gardeners maybe not all of us, but there was that tendency. And then disease and pests have been found on Ecoroof, and for instance, the one, well, not the rat, but disease and pests. We haven't observed any major problems. We have seen some signs of pests on this roof. As I mentioned earlier, the Sedum oreganum, something about it just doesn't look right in a number of locations, and it appears like it's a pest. Dave and I noticed some, the Delosperma, that native plant that's often called a weed that we were looking at in that one location. The leaves are all curled up as if it's like aphids or something that is affecting it.
Really short compared to all the rest of them.
Right, yeah.
Stunted growth.
Right.
And then the other one was the Delosperma, the ice plant. And both Tom and I have noticed on our Ecoroofs that there is something that's nibbling the tops of all the little leaflets off. So either if that's a infestation or just a pest, slugs or something that's chewing on it.
Right. So there are pests, but these pests, to our observation, have not been, what would you call it? They're not significant in terms of their impact on the plants, in terms of their viability to survive and keep going. And so part of that is because perhaps there are other things that fit in to help those plants. Anyway, so unhealthy plants. So find the cause. So is it a pest that's addressing it? Is it too much water, not enough water? Is it water from the HVA system that's continually flowing during the summertime? Are there other trades such as other maintenance type activities that are up on the roof that you're not aware of that are possibly damaging the roof? And then potentially competition between plants. Is one plant out competing the other, and is it a plant that you don't want to do that, which then you would call it a weed? And then this other issue of aesthetics. So the idea of how neat and tidy does it have to be, or does it have to be neat and tidy at all? And a lot of the projects that we have worked on, for instance, Multnomah County, it's right on the 5th floor. It's got a terrace area that goes out there. They've actually let a lot of plants grow that you might call weeds, and a lot of them are native plants, and I really don't know, in some cases, the difference between some of the natives and some of the non-natives. And I think a lot of us don't. Problems are usually associated with too much irrigation as it relates to what might be considered weeds. So this is a real tricky one, and this is what we noticed at the O&M building, that because we didn't do anything and we didn't water it, by the time we got up there in October, almost all of the things that looked like they were weeds, they were just little skimpy twigs and things that were just barely there, and you could see where some of them had fallen off. In other words, they were all dry and dead. And I imagine if we had gone up there in July or something, these would have been weeds that looked like, oh my gosh, it's full of weeds and we better pull them all. Now this is in a remote area, so nobody sees this roof except from the bluff, and you can't see it that close. But it also relates to then when we talk about cost and all the things that go into this, the biggest factor that seems to imply more cost for a project is the interaction between people and that roof and our perception of the aesthetic. And we do like things to look a certain way. Anyway, when plants are damaged by air vents or other causes, the HVAC condensate that's draining out. And you remember from last week, I think this is the next, it's not there. Well, I'll show you a slide of that in a minute. Anyway, and then specifying which plant. So this, again, this is preparing your O&M plan. You want to prepare this information. So what is a weed on your project? So you've got a certain design, and you want to be able to talk about that. Now, in general, trees unless you want that tree to grow, a tree is a weed because the potential for the root to get in and damage the membrane, even if you have a TPO or even if you have something else, there is a potential problem there with very aggressive trees. So you want to be careful about trees. A lot of trees, though, can, if they're, and this is back to that, if you water a little bit and you think you're keeping the sedum alive, you might be watering enough, just enough for that tree to stay alive as well, or a weed to stay alive. So that can be a problem. And then, of course, the abundance of dry grasses or other plants can be a problem on a roof, and you want to make sure to tell people what to do at certain times, especially depending on where you're located, if it's at a lower level before the 4th of July, when we have people shooting off fireworks that may be illegal in Portland, but they still shoot off all these rockets. And as I said last week, I had 2 bottle rocket caps in my backyard that I found from this past, and I didn't do it. It's my neighbors. Yeah.
Do any of the eco-roofs that you're watching have trouble with leaf buildup from external sources? Like
I wouldn't say they have trouble, but on some of the lower ones, I have noticed in some locations on the roof, there's an accumulation of leaves in certain places where there's sort of an eddy or something. Just a few that are lower roofs where the leaves have fallen off.
You could actually smother your sedums.
Yeah, but you just have, that's part of your design. So yes, in looking at operations and maintenance, that's part of your job as a designer to say, okay, first find out if it's an existing building, you can observe that kind of thing and try and get that information. That would be a good part of your site analysis or roof analysis that you do before you do the design. And then blackberries and English ivy, these have not been observed except on roofs that are irrigated. So it's back to, and especially where they're irrigated too much. You irrigate, and all of these plants that are very invasive in Portland have, not all of them, but a number of them have found their way on eco-roofs, and they need to be removed. And then identify, of course, so what's not a weed and what in weed control. So, of course, the plants that you planted are not weeds. Prolific growing plants not originally planted that might be natives or well-behaved non-native species and do no harm could be plants to which you would say, okay, if you see these plants growing, then they're okay. Leave them. It's okay that you let that they've decided to land on this roof and start growing and incorporate themselves into my original design. Now that might be hard to do, but that would be an idea. So trying to think of an example of that. And there was, well, I can't think of a good example of that. Anyway, and then be patient and watch them, see if they cause a problem, if there's something that looks like it might be okay on the roof, but you just don't know. So this is for the maintenance people. So you would have that in your O&M plan, saying to the maintenance person, keep an eye on the plants, and if you see something come in that's not part of the original design, trying to identify, is it a weed and that you have identified, such as blackberry and other commonly referred to weeds, or is it something different? And before you start removing it. And so this would be specifically identifying what you would tell the maintenance person to do. So check, for instance, you'd say check for trees and other weeds in around late May and early June. And if you get them then, before we get into our really dry period, as Dave was talking about, the July and August, if you get most of the weeds then and we don't have an unusual rainy season, then you pretty much will have controlled most of the weeds. Now, depending on how much you irrigate, if you're irrigating. So you could just say, you know what, get up there once a month and remove the weeds because we're going to irrigate, and that's just the way it is relative to your project. And then you might have to weed again. Okay. So think low maintenance related to allow good weeds to become a part of the Ecoroof. So have any of you seen the book called Good Weeds of the West? Have you heard of the book called Weeds of the West? one or two people have. Yeah. So there's this really neat book. It's about this thick. It's called Weeds of the West. And what's interesting is there are a few species in there that are a landscape architect may not say is a weed, and perhaps in some locations are not necessarily weeds. It was written mainly for the ag industry and ranching and things like that, so it's from that perspective. So it'd be really neat if somebody writes a book someday called Good Weeds of the West for Ecoroof, maybe. Anyway, so these are just methods of removing weeds or addressing weeds. So weeds, if you pull them, they, when you pull them, the tendency is for the roots and soil then to come out with the weed. And when you do that, and if it's a large area, you can end up with a pile of weeds and soil and stuff that's 2 or 3 feet high. And then what do you do with all that? And then there's all that soil that you bought, so or somebody purchased, which is not exactly cheap, even if you get it at a good price. You have paid for that soil. So to have the soil be taken off the roof with the weeds, and we talked about it last week, having a place where you can compost. But one of the ideas is instead of actually pulling the weeds, then you can cut the weeds. But if you pull them and you get that soil, you can pull and drop, although you take a chance of that weed not actually dying. If you cut and drop the material, then a lot of the soils, if you don't water it too much, the weed's going to basically die. Now, some weeds are so aggressive, they will come back, and it's just an ongoing maintenance thing. But if you can do that, the more the sedum grows and the more you can kind of work on the weeds in the first 2 years, the sedum can get strong enough that it can pretty much withstand a lot of the impacts associated with these other plants. Oh, I already said that. Pull and bag. And then, of course, cutting with a weed whacker, mower, hoe, clippers, cut and bag or cut and drop. Having the compost container. Did I miss anything here? Combination of selective pulling, cutting. Let some of them part of the design. No herbicides, I said that. Show a composting area. We already talked about that. So then there are the insects. So understanding what insects are bad, what insects are good, and there's another book for somebody. So this is my garage. It says this owner, but it's me. So the worst thing that's happened in my garage is I've had ants that have made a little colony on my roof. So every spring they do their thing that they normally do when they come up out of the basement of the house or I have an old house. So these little black ants, and they dig around a lot. And so the plants usually die because they pretty much, I don't know if they're eating the roots or what, but it's usually a small area, and it's not anything that's been too big a deal. And then there are a lot of insects, of course, that eat other insects. So, ladybugs, and we've seen these damselflies up here. I'm not sure if this is a good insect or a bad insect. It's some kind of beetle, but definitely different species that eat other bugs, and some of those are pests. So we have seen aphids on the roof, and we've seen a lot of ladybugs eating those aphids up on this roof, and we just left it, and it appears everything's being controlled by the nice guys.